All right. There. Okay. Hey everyone. Hope you all had a fantastic Thursday. Today we're gonna finish reading Conan the Scarlet Citadel. So here we are. I was having a great day until I remembered all the coffee machines at the office are broken. It's alright. Got through it. So we left off towards the end of part 3 of 5, I remember, if I remember right. Oh, let's jump right into it. Or actually, before we jump right into it, to recap the first 3.5 parts of this story. The first part, Conan went to battle with treacherous, well, he was ambushed by treacherous allies he was trying to go help. Then he was taken captive by a dickhead wizard. Then he was taken to the treacherous allies' capital, then to the wizard's citadel in the capital, and into the spooky dungeons beneath that. Conan broke free after there was a pirate or something that came to try and assassinate him in the dungeon, but then the giant 40-foot, or is it 80-foot long snake killed the assassin guy, and the assassin guy dropped the keys, so Conan broke free, and he's been stumbling around the dark and gloomy dungeon since. And at some point along the way, he encountered the eunuch jailer, stabbed him through the bars, and left behind to continue exploring the dungeon. So, we left off here on page 111. Third column over. Let's get into it again. Da, da, da. To Conan, the serpent was the least horror of them. He almost felt a kinship with it when he remembered the weeping, tittering obscenity and the dripping, mouthing thing that came out of the well. At least it was of earthly matter. It was a crawling death, but it threatened only physical extinction, whereas these other horrors menaced mind and soul as well. After it had passed on down the corridor, he felt... What was passing? Maybe I need to back up, because I don't remember what was passing him. What is this? Oh, okay, it's that 80-footy or 80-foot serpent passing by. That's what's passing by. Got it. That's right. Conan heard a noise, so he ducked into a little nook in the tunnel to let whatever is coming go by him. And then he encountered other horrors besides that snake. Okay. After it had passed on down the corridor, he followed, at what he hoped was a safe distance, blowing his torch into flame again. Sorry, I had to pause there, parse that sentence I just read. He had not gone far when he heard a low moan that seemed to emanate from the black entrance of a tunnel nearby. Caution warned him on, but curiosity drove him to the tunnel, holding high the torch that was now little more than a stump. He was braced for the sight of anything, yet what he saw was what he had least expected. He was looking into a broad cell, and the space of this was caged off with closely set bars extending from floor to ceiling, set firmly in the stone. Then these bars lay a figure, which as he approached, he saw was either a man or the exact likeness of a man, twined and bound about with the tendrils of a thick vine which seemed to grow through the solid stone of the floor. It was covered with strangely pointed leaves and crimson blossoms, not the satiny red of natural petals, but a livid, unnatural crimson, like a perversity of flower life. Sometimes those words are cut off to the next line. That catches me off guard. Perversity of flower life. Its clinging, pliant branches wound about the man's naked body and limbs, seeming to caress his shrinking flesh with lustful, avid kisses. One great blossom hovered exactly over his mouth. A low bestial moaning drooled from the loose lips. The head rolled as if in unbearable agony. The eyes looked full at Conan, but there was no light of intelligence in them. They were blank, glassy, the eyes of an idiot. Now the great crimson blossom dipped and pressed its petals over. Track to the side there. Now the great crimson blossom dipped and pressed its petals over the writhing lips. The limbs of the wretch twisted in anguish. The tendrils of the plant quivered as if in ecstasy, vibrating their full snaky lengths. Waves of changing hues surged over them. Their color grew deeper, more venomous. Conan did not understand what he saw, but he knew that he looked on horror of some kind. Capital H horror. That's big boys. And her demon. The suffering of the captive touched Conan's wayward and impulsive heart. He sought for entrance and found a grille-like door in the bars, fastened with a heavy lock, for which he found a key among the keys he carried, and entered. Instantly, the petals of the livid blossoms spread like the hood of a cobra. The tendrils reared menacingly, and the whole plant shook and swayed toward him. Here was no blind growth of natural vegetation. Conan sensed a malignant intelligence. The plant could see him, and he felt its hate emanate from it in almost tangible waves. Stepping warily nearer, he marked the root stem, a repulsively supple stalk, thicker than his thigh, and even as the long tendrils arched toward him with a rattle of leaves and hiss, he swung his sword and cut through the stem with a single stroke. Instantly, the wretch in its clutches was thrown violently aside as the great vine lashed and knotted like a beheaded serpent, rolling into a huge irregular ball. The tendrils thrashed and writhed, the leaves shook and rattled like castanets, and the petals opened and closed convulsively. Then, the whole length straightened out limply. The vivid colors paled and dimmed. A reeking white liquid oozed from the severed stump. The dreaded cum vine. Conan stared, spellbound. Then a sound brought him round, sword lifted. The freed man was on his feet, surveying him. Conan gaped in wonder. No longer were the eyes in the worn face expressionless, dark and meditative. They were alive with intelligence, and the expression of imbecility had dropped from the face like a mask. The head was narrow and well-formed, with a high, splendid forehead. The whole build of the man was aristocratic, evident no less in his tall, slender frame than in his small, trim feet and hands. I don't get what small trim has to do with feet and hands. I guess he just had small baby feet and hands. Okay. Anyways, his first words were strange and startling. "What year is this?" he asked, speaking Gothic. "Today is the 10th day of the month of Yuluk, of the year of the gazelle," answered Conan. "Yagulin Eshtar," murmured the stranger. 10 years. He drew a hand across his brow, shaking his head as if to clear his brain of cobwebs. "All is dim yet. After a 10-year emptiness, the mind cannot be expected to begin functioning clearly at once. Who are you?" "Conan, once of Cimmeria, now king of Aquilonia." The other's eyes showed surprise. "Indeed? And named deities? Namidides. Indeed, in Namidides? "I strangled him on his throne the night I took the royal city," answered Conan. A certain naivety in the king's reply twitched the stranger's lips. "Pardon, your majesty. I should have thanked you for the service you have done me. I am like a man woken suddenly from deep slumber, then death, and shot with nightmares of agony more fierce than hell. But I understand that you delivered me. Tell me, why did you cut the stem of the plant Yathka instead of tearing it up by the roots?" Because I learned long ago to avoid touching with my flesh that which I do not understand, answered the Cimmerian. Well for you, said the stranger. Had you been able to tear it up, you might have found things clinging to the roots against which not even your sword would prevail. Yothka's roots are set in hell. But who are you? Demanded Conan. Men call me Peleus. What? Cried the king. Peleus the sorcerer, Zotha Lanti's rival, who vanished from the earth 10 years ago? Thanks, Mr. Exposition. Not entirely from the earth, answered Peleus with a wry smile. Zotha preferred to keep me alive, in shackles more grim than rusted iron. He pent me in here with this devil flower, whose seeds drifted down through the black cosmos from Yag, the accursed, and found fertile field only in the maggot-writhing corruption that seized in the floors of hell. I could not remember my sorcery and the words and symbols of my power, with that cursed thing gripping me and drinking my soul with its loathsome caress. It sucked the contents of my mind, day and night, leaving my brain as empty as a broken wine jug. 10 years! Ishtar preserve us. Conan found no reply, but stood holding the stump of the torch. And trailing his great sword. Surely the man was mad, yet there was no madness in him. No madness in the dark eyes that rested so calmly on him. Tell me, is the black wizard in Korshamish? Korshamish? Korshamish. But no, you need not reply. My powers begin to wake, and I sense in your mind a great battle, and a king trapped by treachery. And I see Zotha Lanti riding hard for the Tiber, with Strabonus and the king of Ophir. So much the better. My art is too frail from the long slumber to face Zotha yet. I need time to recruit my strength, to assemble my powers. Let us go forth from these pits. Conan jangled his keys discouragedly. Discouragedly. All these words, and then I stumble over the basic ones too. The grill to the outer doors made of... The grill to the outer doors made fast by a bolt, which can be worked only from the outside. Is there no other exit from these tunnels? These really tall and narrow paragraphs, columns on the page, make it hard for me to read. Like, can never gauge the pacing of how long a sentence is going to be. Only one, which neither of us would care to use, seeing that it goes down and not up, laughed Peleus. But no matter, let us see to the grill. He moved towards the corridor with uncertain steps, as of long unused limbs, which gradually became more sure. As he followed Conan remarkably uneasily. There is a cursed snake creeping about this tunnel. Let us be wary, lest we step into his mouth. I remember him of old, answered Peleus grimly. The more I was forced to watch, the more as I was forced to watch while 10 of my acolytes were fed to him. That sentence does not make sense. I cannot parse that. He is Satha, the Old One, chiefest of Zotha's pets. Did Zotha dig these pits for no other reason than to house his cursed monstrosities? Asked Conan. He did not dig them. When the city was founded 3,000 years ago, there were ruins of an earlier city on and about this hill. King Khosus V, the founder, built this palace on the hill, and digging cellars beneath it, came upon a walled-up doorway, which he broke into and discovered the pits, which were about as we see them now. But his Grand Vizier, I think it's Vizier, came to such a grisly end in them that Khosus came in a fright, walled up the entrance again. He said the Vizier fell into a well, but he had the cellars filled in and later abandoned the palace itself and built himself another in the suburbs, from which he fled in a panic on discovering some black mold scattered on the marble floor of his palace one morning. I mean, black mold is pretty bad. Can't blame the man. He then departed with his whole court to the eastern corner of the kingdom and built a new city. The palace on the hill was not used and fell into ruins. When Akutho The first revived the lost glories of Korshamish. He built a fortress there. He remained for South Atlanti to rear the Scarlet Citadel and open the way to the pits again. Whatever fate overtook the Grand Vizier of Kosas, Sotha avoided it. He fell into no well, though he did descend into a well he found, and he came out with a strange expression which has not since left his eyes. I have seen that well, but I do not care to seek in it for wisdom. Oh, this is him, not Conan. I am a sorcerer, and older than men reckon, but I am human. As for Sotha, men say that a dancing girl of Shadizar slept too near the pre-human ruins on Dagoth Hill. That's a Lovecraft word. And woke in the grip of a black demon. From that unholy union was spawned an accursed hybrid men call Sotha Lanti. Conan cried out sharply and recoiled, thrusting his companion back. Before them rose the great shimmering white form of Satha, an ageless hate in its eyes. Conan tensed himself for one mad berserker onslaught to thrust the glowing... Say that on this Christian website. His glowing bundle of sticks into that fiendish countenance and throw his life into the ripping sword stroke. But the snake was not looking at him. It was glaring over his shoulder at the man called Peleus. He stood with his arms folded, smiling. His arms were smiling, huh? And in the great, cold yellow eyes, slowly the hate died out in the glitter of pure fear. The only time Conan ever saw such an expression in a reptile's eyes. With a swirling rush like the sweep of a strong wind, the great snake was gone. What did he see to frighten him? Asked Conan, eyeing his companion uneasily. The scaled people see what escapes the mortal eye, answered Peleus cryptically. You see my fleshly guise, he saw my naked soul. Lewd. An icy trickle disturbed Conan's spine, and he wondered if, after all, Peleus were a man or merely another demon of the pits, in a mask of humanity. He contemplated the advisability of driving a sword through his companion's back without further hesitation. But while he pondered, they came to the steel grill, etched blackly in the torches beyond, and the body of Shukeli, still slumped against the bars in a curdled welter of crimson. Robert E. Howard is really good about stringing long, overcomplicated sentences filled with words that are hard to say one after another. At least for me. It's still fun to read, though. Peleus laughed, and his laugh was not pleasant to hear. By the ivory hips of Ishtar, he is a fate enthusiast. Who is our doorman? Lo, is no less than the noble Shukeli, who hang my young men by their feet and skin them with squeals of laughter. Do you sleep, Shukeli? Why do you lie so stiffly, with your fat belly sunk like a dressed pig's? Is dead, muttered Conan, ill at ease to hear these wild words. Dead or alive, laughed Peleus. He shall open the door for us. He clapped his hands and sharply cried, Rise, Shukeli! Rise from hell and rise from the bloody floor and open the door for your masters. Rise, I say! An awful groan reverberated through the vaults. Conan's hairs stood on end, and he felt clammy sweat bead his hide. For the body of Shukeli stirred and moved, with infantile gropings of the fat hands. The laughter of Peleus was merciless as a flint hatchet, as the form of the eunuch reeled upright, clutching at the bars of the grill. Conan, glaring at him, felt his blood turn to ice, and the marrow of his bones to water. For Shukeli's wide-open eyes were glassy and empty, and from the great gash in his belly, his entrails hung limply to the floor. The eunuch's feet stumbled among his entrails as he worked the bolt, moving like a brainless automaton. When he immediately flooded my head with helldivers. When he had first stirred, Conan had thought that by some incredible chance the eunuch was alive, but the man was dead, had been dead for hours. Peleus sauntered through the open grill, and Conan crowded through behind him, sweat pouring from his body, shrinking away from the awful shape that slumped on, sagging legs against the gate. It held open. Peleus passed on without a backward glance, and Conan followed him, in the grip of a nightmare nausea. He had not taken half a dozen strides when a sodden thud brought him round. Shukeli's corpse lay limply at the foot of the grill. His task is done, and hell gapes for him again, remarked Peleus pleasantly, politely affecting not to notice the strong shudder which shook Conan's mighty frame. He led the way up the long stairs, and through the brass skull-crowned door at the top. Should be a comma in there somewhere. Conan gripped his sword, expecting a rush of slaves, but silence gripped the citadel. They passed through the black corridor, and came into that in which the censers swung, billowing forth their everlasting incense. Still, they saw no one. The slaves and soldiers are quartered in another part of the citadel, remarked Peleus. Tonight, their master being away, they doubtless lie drunk on wine or lotus juice. Oh. There. Conan glanced through an arched golden-silled window that led out upon a broad balcony, and swore in surprise to see the dark blue star-flecked sky. It had been shortly after sunrise when he was thrown into the pits. Now it was past midnight. He could scarcely realize he had been so long underground. He was suddenly aware of thirst and a ravenous appetite. Peleus led the way into a gold-domed chamber, floored with silver, its lapis lazuli walls pierced by the fretted arches of many doors. With a sigh, Peleus sank onto a silken divan. Gold and silks again, he sighed. Sotha affects to be above the pleasures of the flesh, but he is a half-devil. I am human, despite my black arts. I love ease and good cheer. That's how Sotha trapped me. He caught me helpless with drink. Wine is a curse. By the ivory bosom of Ishtar, even as I speak of it, the traitor is here. Friend, please pour me a goblet. Hold! I forgot that you are a king. I will pour. The devil with that, growled Conan, filling a crystal goblet and proffering it to Peleus. Then lifting the jug, he drank deeply from the mouth, echoing Peleus's sigh of satisfaction. The dog knows good wine, said Conan, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. But by Crom, Peleus, are we to sit here until soldiers awake and cut our throats? No fear, answered Peleus. Would you like to see how fortune holds with Strabonus? Blue fire burned in Conan's eyes, and he gripped his sword until his knuckles showed blue. Oh, to be at sword points with him, he rumbled. Peleus lifted a great shimmering globe from an ebony table. I was mentally AFK for a while there. I was thinking about Ishtar from Fate still. Peleus lifted a great shimmering globe from an ebony table. Ishtar's pretty hot, though. Not gonna lie. TBH. Sotha's crystal, a childish toy, but useful when there is a lack of time for higher science. Look in, your majesty. He laid it on the table before Conan's eyes. The king looked into cloudy depths which steepened and expanded. Slowly, images crystallized out of mist and shadows. He was looking on a familiar landscape. Broad plains ran to a wide, winding river, beyond which the level lands ran up quickly into a maze of low hills. On the northern bank of a river stood a walled town, guarded by a moat connected at each end with the river. By Crom! Ejaculated Conan. It's Shamar. The dogs besiege it. Interesting verb. Just how it was back then. The invaders had crossed the river. Their pavilion stood in the narrow plain between the city and the hills. Their warriors swarmed about the walls, their mail gleaming palely under the moon. Arrows and stone rained on them from the towers, and they staggered back, but came on again. Even as Conan cursed, the scene changed. Tall spires and gleaming domes stood up in the mist, and he looked on his own capital of Tamar, where all was confusion. He saw the steel-clad knights of Poitin, his staunchest supporters, riding out of the gate, hooted and hissed by the multitude which swarmed the streets. He saw looting and rioting, and men at arms whose shields bore the insignia of Pelia, manning the towers and swaggering through the markets. Overall, like a phantasmal mirage, he saw the dark, triumphant face of Prince Arpello of Pelia. The images faded. So, raved Conan, my people turn on me the moment my back is turned. Again, because that's what happened in the first story. Not entirely, broke in Peleus. They have heard that you are dead. There is no one to protect them from their outer enemies in civil war, they think. Naturally, they turn to the strongest noble to avoid the horrors of anarchy. They do not trust the Poitanians, remembering former wars, but Arpello is on hand, and the strongest prince of the central provinces. When I came to Aquilonia again, he will be but a headless corpse rotting on Traitors' Common. Conan grounded his teeth. Badass. They got a section of the city named Traitors' Common. That's metal, man. Yet before you reach your capital, reminded Peleus, Strabonus may be before you. At least his riders will be ravaging your kingdom. True. Conan paced the chamber like a caged lion. The fastest horse I could not reach Shamar before midday. Even there I could do no good except die with the people when the town falls, as fall it will in a few days at most. From Shamar to Tamar is a 5 days ride, even if you kill your horses on the road. Before I could reach my capital and raise an army, Strabonus would be hammering at the gates. Because raising an army is going to be hell. All my damnable nobles will have scattered to their own cursed fiefs. Fiefs at the word of my death. And since the people have driven out Trocero of Poitin, and there's none to keep Arpello's greedy hands off the crown and the crown treasure, he'll hand the country over to Strabonus in return for a mock throne. And as soon as Strabonus' back is turned, he'll stir up revolt, but the nobles won't support him. And it will only be Strabonus' excuse for annexing. It will only give Strabonus excuse for annexing the kingdom openly. Stuck there for a second. Oh, Crom, Emir, and Set. If I had but had wings that fly like lightning to Tamar. Peleus, who sat tapping the jade. I thought it was ebony. A table. Sat tapping the jade tabletop with his fingernails, halted suddenly, and rose as with a definite purpose, beckoning Conan to follow. The king complied, sunk in moody thoughts, and Peleus led the way out of the chamber and up a flight of marble, gold-worked stairs that led out on the pinnacle of the citadel, the roof of the tallest tower. It was night, and a strong wind was blowing through the star-filled skies, stirring Conan's black mane. Far below them twinkled the lights of Korshemesh, seemingly farther away than the stars above them. Peleus seemed withdrawn and aloof here, one in cold unhuman greatness for the company of the stars. There are creatures, said Peleus, not alone of earth and sea, but of air, in the far reaches of the skies as well, dwelling apart, unguessed of men. Yet to him who holds the master words, and signs, and the knowledge underlying all, they are not malignant nor accessible. Watch, and fear not. He lifted his hands to the skies, and sounded a long, weird call that seemed to shudder endlessly out into space, dwindling and fading, yet never dying out, only receding farther and farther into some unreckoned cosmos. In the silence that followed, Conan heard a sudden beat of wings in the stars, and recalled as a huge bat-like creature alighted beside him. He saw its great calm eyes regarding him in the starlight. He saw the 40-foot spread of its giant wings. He saw it was neither bat nor bird. Mount and ride, said Peleus. By dawn it will bring you to Tamar. By Crom, muttered Conan. Is this all a nightmare from which I shall presently awaken in my palace at Tamar? What of you? I would not leave you alone among your enemies. Be at ease regarding me, answered Peleus. At dawn, the people of Korshmesh will know that they have a new master. Doubt not what the gods have sent you. I will meet you in the plain by Shamar. Doubtfully, Conan clambered upon the bridge's back, gripping the arched neck, still convinced that he was in the grasp of a fantastic nightmare. With a great rush and thunder of titan wings, the creature took the air, and the king grew dizzy as he saw the lights of the city dwindle far below him. Part 4. The sword that slays the king cuts the cords of empire. Aquilonian proverb. Fancy folk them. The streets of Tamar swarmed with howling mobs, shaking fists and rusty pikes. It was the hour before dawn of the second day after the Battle of Shamu, and events had occurred so swiftly as to daze the mind. By means known only to Sotholanti, word had reached Tamar of the king's death within half a dozen hours after the battle. Chaos had resulted. The barons had deserted the royal capital, galloping away to secure their castles against marauding neighbors. The well-knit kingdom Conan had built up seemed tottering on the edge of dissolution, and commoners and merchants trembled at the imminence of a return. Of a return of the feudalistic regime. Apparently, it wasn't that well knit. It only took like one day of the king being AWOL. Anyways. The people howled for a king to protect them against their... This is also why kings have heirs. And Conan definitely fucks. There's no way he doesn't at least have bastards hanging around. Anyways. The people howled for a king to protect them against their own aristocracy, no less than foreign foes. Count Trocero, left by Conan in charge of the city, tried to reassure them. But in their unreasoning terror, they remembered old civil wars, and how the same count had besieged Tamar 15 years before. It was shouted in the streets that Trocero had betrayed the king, that he planned to plunder the city. The mercenaries began looting the quarters, dragging forth screaming merchants and terrified women. Trocero swept down on the looters, littered the streets with their corpses, drove them back into their quarter in confusion, and arrested their leaders. Still, the people rushed wildly about, with brainless squawks, screaming that the count had incited the riot for his own purposes. Prince Arpello came before this distracted council and announced himself ready to take over the government of the city until a new king could be decided upon. Conan having no son, as previously established. While they debated, his agents stole subtly among the people, who snatched at a shred of royalty. The council heard the storm outside the palace windows, where the multitude roared for Arpello the rescuer. The council surrendered. Trocero at first refused the order to give up his baton of authority, but the people swarmed about him, hissing and howling, hurling stones and offal at his knights. Seeing the futility of a pitched battle in the streets with Arpello's retainers under such conditions, Trocero hurled the baton in his rival's face, hanged the leaders and the mercenaries in the market square as his last official act, and rode out of the southern gate at the head of his 1,500 steel-clad knights. The gate slammed behind him, and Arpello's suave mask fell away to reveal the grim visage of the hungry wolf. With the mercenaries cut to pieces or hiding in their barracks, his were the only soldiers in Tamar. Sitting his warhorse in the great square, Arpello proclaimed himself king of Aquilonia amid the clamor of the deluded multitude. Publius the chancellor, who opposed this move, was thrown into prison. The merchants, who had greeted the proclamation of a king with relief, now found with consternation that the new monarch's first act was to levy a staggering tax on them. 6 rich merchants, sent as a delegation of protest, were seized and their heads slashed off without ceremony. A shocked and stunned silence followed this execution. The merchants, confronted by a power they could not control with money, fell on their fat bellies and licked their oppressors' boots. The common people were not perturbed at the fate of the merchants, but they began to murmur when they found that the swaggering Pelian soldiery, pretending to maintain order, were as bad as Turanian bandits. Complaints of extortion, murder, and rape poured into Arpello, who had taken up his quarters in Publius's palace, because the desperate counselors, doomed by his order, were holding the royal palace against his soldiers. He had taken possession of the pleasure palace, however, and Conan's girls were dragged to his quarters. The people muttered at the sight of the royal beauties writhing the brutal hands of the iron-clad retainers, dark-eyed damsels of Poiton, slim black-haired wenches from Zamora, Dingara, and Hyrcania, Brythunian girls with tousled yellow heads, all weeping with fright and shame, unused to brutality. Night fell on a city of bewilderment and turmoil, and before midnight, word spread mysteriously in the streets that the Kothians had followed up their victory and were hammering at the walls of Shamar. Somebody in Sotha's mysterious secret service had babbled. Fear shook the people like an earthquake, and they did not even pause to wonder at the witchcraft by which the news had been so swiftly transmitted. They stormed at Arpello's door, demanding that he march southward and drive the enemy back over the Tibor. He might have subtly pointed out that his force was not sufficient, and that he could not raise an army until the barons recognized his claim to the crown, but he was drunk with power and laughed in their faces. A young student, Athamides, mounted a column in the market, and with burning words, accused Arpello of being a cat's paw first bonus, painting a vivid picture of existence under Kothian rule, with Arpello as a satrap. Before he finished, the multitude was screaming with fear and howling with rage. Arpello sent his soldiers to arrest the youth, but the people caught him up and fled with him, deluging the pursuing retainers with stones and dead cats. That's just mean-spirited. A volley of crossbow quarrels routed the mob, and a charge of horsemen littered the market with bodies, but Athamides was smuggled out of the city to plead with Trocero to retake Tamar and march to aid Shemar. Athamides found Trocero breaking his camp outside the walls, ready to march to Poiton, in the far southwestern corner of the kingdom. To the youth's urgent pleas, he answered that he had neither the force necessary to storm Tamar, even with the aid of the mob inside, nor to face Trebonus. Besides, avaricious nobles would plunder Poiton behind his back, while he was fighting the Kothians. With the king dead, each man must protect his own. He was riding to Poiton, there to defend it as best he might against Arpello and his foreign allies. While Athamides pleaded with Trocero, the mob still raved in the city with helpless fury. Under the great tower beside the royal palace, the people swirled and milled, screaming their hate at Arpello, who stood on the turrets and laughed down at them while his archers ranged the parapets, bolts drawn and fingers on the triggers of their arbalists. The Prince of Pelia was a broad-built man of medium height, with a dark, stern face. He was an intriguer, but he was also a fighter. Under his silken jupon, with his gilt-braided skirts and jagged sleeves, glimmered burnished steel. Water. His long black hair was curled and scented, and bound back with a cloth of silver band. But at his hip hung a broadsword, the jeweled hilt of which was worn with battles and campaigns. Fools! Howl as you will! Conan is dead and Arpello is king! What if all Aquilonia were leagued against him? He had men enough to hold the mighty walls until Trebonus came up. But Aquilonia was divided against itself. Already, the barons were girding themselves each to seize his neighbor's treasure. Again, a really tight-knit kingdom it was. Arpello had only the helpless mob to deal with. Trebonus would carve through the loose lines of the warring barons as a galley ran through foam, and until his coming, Arpello had only to hold the royal capital. Fools! Arpello is king! The sun was rising over the eastern towers. Out of the crimson dawn came a flying speck that grew to a bat, then to an eagle. Then all who saw screamed in amazement, for over the walls of Tamar swooped a shape such as men knew only in half-forgotten legends, and from between its titan wings sprang a human form as it roared over the great tower. Then, with a deafening thunder of its wings, it was gone, and the folk blinked, wondering if they dreamed. But on the turret stood a wild, barbaric figure, half naked, blood-stained, brandishing a great sword. And from the multitude rose a roar that rocked the towers. "The king! It is the king!" Arpello stood transfixed. Then with a cry he drew and leaped at Conan. With a lion-like roar, the Cimmerian parried the whistling blade, then dropped his own sword, gripped the prince, and heaved him high above his head by crotch and neck. "Take your plots to hell with you," he roared, and like a sack of salt, he hurled the Prince of Pelia far out to fall through empty space for 150 feet. The people gave back as the body came hurtling down to smash on the marble pave, spattering blood and brains, and lie crushed in its splintered armor like a mangled beetle. Badass, man. Archers on the tower shrank back, their nerve broken. They fled, and the beleaguered councilmen sallied from the palace and hewed into them with joyous abandon. Councilmen are pretty badass too. Pelian knights and men-at-arms sought safety in the streets, and the crowd tore them to pieces. In the streets, the fighting milled and eddied, plumed helmets and steel caps tossed among the tousled heads, and then vanished. Swords hacked madly in a heaving forest of pikes, and over all rose the roar of the mob, shouts of acclaim mingling with screams of bloodlust and howls of agony. And high above all, the naked figure of the king rocked and swayed on the dizzy battlements, mighty arms brandished, roaring with gargantuan laughter that mocked all mob's D&D princes, even himself. Another typo there. Conan is such a fucking badass, man. It's awesome. Part 5. A long bow and strong bows, and let the sky grow dark. The cord to knock, the shaft to the ear, and the king of Koth for a mark. Song of the Basonian archers. The mid-afternoon sun glinted on the placid waters of the Tibor, washing the southern bastions of Shamar. The haggard defenders knew that few of them would see that sunrise again. The pavilions of the besiegers dotted the plain. The people of Shamar had not been able to successfully dispute the crossing of the river, outnumbered as they were. Barges, chained together, made a bridge over which the invader poured his hordes. Strabonus had not dared march on Aquilonia with Shamar unsubdued at his back. He had sent his light riders, his Spahis, inland to ravage the country, and had reared up his siege engines in the plain. He had anchored a flotilla of boats, furnished them by Amalrus, in the middle of the stream, over against the river wall. Some of these boats had been sunk by stones from the city's ballistas, which crashed through their decks and ripped out their planking, but the rest held their places, and from their bows and mastheads, protected by bandits, archers raked the riverward turrets. These were Shemites, born with bows in their hands, not to be matched by Aquilonian archers. On the landward side, mangonels rained boulders and tree trunks among the defenders, shattering through roofs and crushing humans like beetles. Rams pounded incessantly at the stones. Sappers... Wouldn't rams pound on the gates? Maybe it's a thin wall. Sappers burrowed like moles in the earth, sinking their minds beneath the towers. The moat had been dammed at the upper end, and emptied of its water, had been filled up with boulders, earth, and dead horses and men. Under the walls, the mailed figures swarmed, battering at the gates, rearing up scaling ladders, pushing storming towers. Oh, I get what they mean. It's the wheeled towers that go up to the wall and you can just climb up to. Got it. It's a weird name for them. Siege towers. Now, storming towers is weird. Pushing siege towers thronged with spearmen against the turrets. Hope had been abandoned in the city, where a bare 1,500 men resisted 40,000 warriors. No word had come from the kingdom whose outpost the city was. Conan was dead, so the invaders shouted exultantly. Only the strong walls and the desperate courage of the defenders had kept them so long at bay, and that could not suffice forever. The western wall was a mass of rubbish on which the defenders stumbled as I talk, stumbled in hand-to-hand conflict with the invaders. The other walls were buckling from the mines beneath them, the towers leaning in drunkenly. Now the attackers were massing for a storm. The elephants sounded. The steel-clad ranks drew up on the plain. The siege towers, covered with raw bull hides, rumbled forward. The people of Shamar saw the banners of Koth and Ophir flying side by side in the center and made out, among the gleaming knights, the slim, lethal figure of the golden milled Amalrus and the squat black armored form of Strabonus. And between them was a shape that made the bravest blanch with horror, a lean vulture figure in a filmy robe. The pikemen moved forward, flowing over the ground like the glinting waves of river... flowing over the ground like the glinting waves of a river of molten steel. The knights cantered forward, lances lifted, guidons streaming. The warriors on the wall drew a long breath, consigned their souls to Mitra, and gripped their notched and red-stained weapons. Then, without warning, a bugle call cut the din. The riders of Rohan. A drum of hoofs rose above the rumble of the approaching host. North of the plain across which the army moved, rose ranges of low hills, mounting northward and westward like giant stair steps. Now down out of these hills, like blown before a storm, shot the Spahis, who had been laying waste to the countryside, riding low and spurring hard, and behind them, sun shimmered on moving ranks of steel. I feel like there's a word missing there. They moved into full view, out of the defiles? Mailed horsemen, the great lion banner of Aquilonia floating over them. From the electrified watchers on the towers, a great shout rent the skies. In ecstasy, warriors clashed their notched swords on the riven shields, and the people of the town, ragged beggars and rich merchants, harlots in red kirtles and dames in silks and satins, fell to their knees and cried out for joy to Mitra, tears of gratitude streaming down their faces. Strabonus frantically shouting orders with Arbanus. Arbanus. That would wheel around the ponderous lines to meet this unexpected menace, grunted. We still outnumber them, unless they have reserves hidden in the hills. The men on the battle towers can mask any sorties from the city. These are Portanians. We might have guessed Trocero would try some such mad gallantry. Amalrus cried out in unbelief. I see Trocero and his captain Prospero, but who rides between them? Ishtar preserve us, shrieked Strabonus, paling. It is King Conan! You are mad, squalled Sotha, startling convulsively. Conan has been in Sotha's belly for days. He stopped short, glaring wildly at the host which was dropping down, file by file, into the plain. He could not mistake the giant figure in the black, gilt-worked armor on the great black stallion, riding beneath the billowing silken folds of the great banner. A scream of feline fury burst from Sotha's lips. Flecking his beard with foam. For the first time in his life, Strabonus saw the wizard completely upset and shrank from the sight. Here is sorcery, screamed Sotha, clawing madly at his beard. How could he have escaped and reached his kingdom in time to reach with an army so quickly? This is the work of Peleus. Curse him! I feel his hand in this. May I be cursed for not killing him when I had the power. The kings gaped at the mention of a man they believed 10 years dead, and panic, emanating from the leaders, shook the host. All recognized the streeter on the black stallion. Sotha felt the superstitious dread of his men, and fury made a hellish mask of his face. Strike home, he screamed, brandishing his lean arms madly. We are still the stronger. Charge and crush these dogs. We shall yet feast in the ruins of Shamar tonight. Oh, Set! He lifted his hands and invoked the serpent god to even Strabonus' horror. Grant us victory, and I swear I will offer up to thee 500 virgins of Shamar, writhing in their blood. Meanwhile, the opposing host had debouched onto the plain. With the knights came what seemed a second irregular army on tough, swift ponies. These dismounted and formed their ranks on foot. Stolid, weird word, Bostonian archers and keen pikemen from Gunderland, their tawny locks blowing from under their steel caps. It was a motley army Conan had assembled in the wild hours following his return to the capital. He had beaten the frothing mob away from the pelting soldiers who held the outer walls of Tamar, and impressed them into his service. He had sent a swift rider after Tracera to bring him back. With these as a nucleus of an army, he had raced southward, sweeping the countryside for recruits and for mounts. Nobles of Tamar and the surrounding countryside had augmented his forces, and he had levied recruits from every village and castle along his road. Yet it was but a paltry force he had gathered to dash against the invading hosts through the quality of tempered steel. 1,900 armored horsemen followed him, the main bulk of which consisted of the Poitanian knights, the remnants of the mercenaries and professional soldiers, and the trains of loyal noblemen made up his infantry. 5,000 archers and 4,000 pikemen. This host now came on in good order. First the archers, then the pikemen behind them. Behind them the knights moving at a walk. Over against them, Arbanus ordered his lines, and the allied army moved forward like a shimmering ocean of steel. The watchers on the city walls shook to see the vast host, which overshadowed the powers of the rescuers. First marched the Shemitish archers, then the Cothian spearmen, then the mailed knights of Scorbunus and Almarus. Arbanus' intent was obvious, to employ his footmen to sweep away the infantry of Conan, and open the way for an overpowering charge of his heavy cavalry. The Shemites opened fire at 500 yards, and arrows flew like hail between the hosts, darkening the sun. The western archers, trained by 1,000 years of merciless warfare with the Pictish savages, came stolidly on, closing their ranks as their comrades fell. They were far outnumbered, and the Shemitish bow had the longer range. But in accuracy the Bostonians were equal to their foes, and they balanced sheer skill in archery by superiority in morale, and in excellency of armor. Within good range they loosed, and the Shemites went down by whole ranks. The blue-bearded warriors in their light mail shirts could not endure punishment as could the heavier armored Bostonians. They broke, throwing away their bows, and their flight disordered the ranks of the Cothian spearmen behind them. Without the support of the archers, these men-at-arms fell by the hundreds before the shafts of the Bostonians, and charging madly into close quarters, they were met by the spears of the pikemen. No infantry was a match for the wired Gundermen, whose homeland, the northernmost province of Aquilonia, was but a day's ride across the Bostonian marches from the borders of Cimmeria, and who, born and bred to battle, were the purest blood of all the Hyborian people. The Cothian spearmen, dazed by their losses and from arrows, were cut to pieces and fell back in disorder. Scorbunus roared in fury as he saw his infantry repulse, and shouted for a general charge. Arbanus demurred. I'll have to stop doing that just because it's so silly. Pointing out the Bostonians reforming in good order before the Aquilonian knights, who had set their steeds motionless during the melee. The general advised a temporary retirement to draw the Western Knights out of the cover of the bows, but Scorbunus was mad with rage. He looked at the long shimmering ranks of his knights. He glared at the handful of mailed figures over against him, and he commanded Arbanus to give the order to charge. The general commended his soul to the Ishtar and sounded the golden elephant. Elephant, a horn, or an elephant? Maybe it's like a horn that resembles an elephant trunk? That's my only guess. With a thunderous roar, the forest of lances dipped, and the great host rolled across the plain, gaining momentum as it came. The whole plain shook to the rumbling avalanche of hoofs, and the... Hoofs? Hoofs. Hoofs, I guess. And the shimmer of gold and steel dazzled the watchers on the towers of Shamar. The squadrons clave the loose ranks of the spearmen, riding down the fiend and foe alike. Friend and foe alike, and rushed into the teeth of a blast of arrows from the Bostonians. Across the plain they thundered, grimly riding the storm that scattered their way with gleaming nights like autumn leaves. Another 100 paces they would ride among the Bessonians and cut them down like corn. But flesh and blood corn. Corn is native to North America, and in Robert E. Howard's mythology, this is basically northern Africa, with parts of the Mediterranean before the Mediterranean sank to become the sea in his mythology. So I'm not sure where corn would come from. Anyways. Well, then again, Rohan had corn, according to Tolkien, and Middle Earth was a Proto-Europe, which, according to Tolkien's notes, this is second-hand or third-hand to me. But apparently Tolkien envisioned Middle Earth like literally being the before times for Europe, and eventually there would even be Jesus and stuff. But then that corn doesn't make sense there either, because that's Europe and corn comes from America. God bless. Anyways, cut them down like corn, but flesh and blood could not endure the rain of death that now ripped and howled among them. Shoulder to shoulder, feet braced wide, stood the archers, drawing shaft to ear and loosing as one man with deep, short shouts. The whole front rank of the knights melted away, and over the pincushion corpses of horses and riders, their comrades stumbled and fell headlong. Arbanus was down, an arrow through his throat, his skull smashed by the hoofs of his dying warhorse, and confusion ran through the disordered host. Strabonus was screaming in order, Malrus another, and through all ran the superstitious dread the sight of Conan had awakened. And while the gleaming ranks milled in confusion, the trumpets of Conan sounded, and through the opening ranks of the archers crashed the terrible charge of the Aquilonian knights. The host met with a shock like that of an earthquake that shook the tottering towers of Shamar. The disorganized squadrons of the invaders could not withstand the solid steel wedge, bristling with spears, that rushed like a thunderbolt against them. The long lances of the attackers ripped their ranks to pieces, and into the heart of their host rode the knights of Poitin, swinging their terrible two-handed swords. The clash and clangor of steel was as that of a million sledges on many anvils. The watchers on the walls were stunned and deafened by the thunder as they gripped the battlements and watched the steel maelstroms roll and eddy, where plumes tossed high among the flashing swords and standards dipped and reeled. Amalrus went down, dying beneath the trampling hoofs, his shoulder bone hewn in twain by Prospero's two-handed sword. The invaders' numbers had engulfed the 1900 knights of Conan, but about this compact wedge, which hewed deeper and deeper into the looser formation of their foes, the knights of Koth and Ophir strolled and smote in vain. They could not break the wedge. I'm starting to die. Sure, we're almost done. I'm assured of this. Archers and pikemen, having disposed of the Kothian infantry, which was strewn in flight across the plain, came to the edges of the fight, loosing their arrows point blank, running in to slash at the girths and horses' bellies with their knives, thrusting upward to spit the riders on their long pikes. At the tip of the steel wedge, Conan roared his heathen battle cry and swung his greatsword in glittering arcs that made not of steel burgonet or mail habergeon. Straight through a thundering waste of foes he rode, and the knights of Koth closed in behind him, cutting him off from his warriors. As a thunderbolt strikes, Conan struck, hurtling through the ranks by sheer power and velocity, until he came to Strabonus, livid among his palace troops. Now here the battle hung in balance, for with the superior numbers, Strabonus still had opportunity to pluck victory from the knees of the gods. Odd saying. But he screamed when he saw his arch foe within arm's length at last, and lashed out wildly with his axe. It clanged on Conan's helmet, striking fire, and Cimmerian reeled and struck back. The 5-foot blade crushed Strabonus' casque and skull, and the king's charger reared screaming, hurling a limp and sprawling corpse from the saddle. A great cry went up from the host, which faltered and gave back. Trocero and his house troops, hewing desperately, cut their way to Conan's side, and the great banner of Koth went down. Then behind the dazed and stricken invaders went up a mighty clamor, in the blaze of a huge conflagration. The defenders of Shamar had made a desperate sortie, cut down the men masking the gates, and were raging among the tents of the besiegers, cutting down the camp followers, burning the pavilions, and destroying the siege engines. It was the last straw. It was the last straw. The gleaming army melted away in flight, and the furious conquerors cut them down as they ran. They were the defenders, not the conquerors. Anyways. The fugitives raced for the river, but the men on the flotilla, harried sorely by the stones and shafts of the revived citizens, cast loose and pulled for the southern shore, leaving their comrades to their fate. Of these many men gained the shore, racing across the barges that served as a bridge, until the men of Shamar cut these adrift and severed them from the shore. Then the fight became a slaughter. Driven into the river to drown in their armor, or hacked down along the bank, the invaders perished by the thousands. No quarter they had promised, no quarter they got. From the foot of the low hills to the shores of the Tibor, the plain was littered with corpses, and the river whose tide ran red, floated thick with the dead. Of the 1,900 knights who had ridden south with Conan, scarcely 500 lived to boast of their scars, and the slaughter among the archers and pikemen was ghastly. But the great and shining host of Strabonus and Amaris was hacked out of existence, and those that fled were less than those that died. While the slaughter yet went on along the river, the final act of a grim drama was being played out in the meadowland beyond. Among those who had crossed the barge bridge before it was destroyed was Sotha, riding like the wind on a gaunt, weird-looking steed, whose stride no natural horse could match. Ruthlessly riding down friend and foe, he gained the southern bank, and then a glance backward showed him a grim figure on a great black stallion in pursuit. The lashings had already been cut, and the barges were drifting apart, but Conan came recklessly on, leaping a steed from boat to boat, as a man might leap from one cake of floating ice to another. Sotha screamed a curse, but the great stallion took the last leap with a straining groan, and gained the southern bank. Then the wizard fled away into the empty meadowland, and on his trail came the king riding hard, swinging the great sword that spattered his trail with crimson drops. On they fled, the hunted and the hunter, and not a foot could the black stallion gain, though he strained each nerve and thew. Through a sunset land of dim and elusive shadows they fled, till sight and sound of the slaughter died out behind them. Then in the sky appeared a dot, that grew into a huge eagle as it approached, swooping down from the sky. It drove at the head of Sotha's steed, which screamed and reared, throwing its rider. Old Sotha rose and faced his pursuer, his eyes those of a maddened serpent, his face an inhuman mask. In each hand he held something that shimmered, and Conan knew he held death there. The king dismounted and strode toward his foe, his armor clanking, his great sword gripped high. "Again we meet, wizard," he grinned savagely. "Keep off!" screamed Sotha like a blood-mad jackal. "I'll blast the flesh from your bones. You cannot conquer me. If you hack me in pieces, the bits of flesh and bone will reunite and haunt you to your doom. I see the hand of Peleus in this, but I defy ye both. I am Sotha, son of—" Conan rushed, sword gleaming, eyes slits of wariness. Sotha's right hand came back and forward. The king ducked quickly. Something passed by his helmeted head and exploded behind him, searing the very sands with a flash of hellish fire. Before Sotha could toss the globe in his left hand, Conan's sword sheared through his lean neck. The wizard's head shot from his shoulders in an arcing fount of blood, and the robed figure staggered and crumpled drunkenly. Yet the mad black eyes glared up at Conan with no dimming of the feral light. The lips writhed awfully, and the hands groped as searching for the severed head. Then, with a swift rush of wings, something swooped from the sky, the eagle which had attacked Sotho's horse. In its mighty talons, it snatched up the dripping head and soared skyward, and Conan stood struck dumb, for from the eagle's throat boomed human laughter, in the voice of Peleus the sorcerer. Then a hideous thing came to pass, for the headless body reared up from the sand, and staggered away in an awful flight on stiffening legs, hands blindly outstretched toward the dot, speeding and dwindling in the dusky sky. Conan stood like one turned to stone, watching until the swift reeling figure faded in the dusk that purpled the meadows. Crom! His mighty shoulders twitched. A murrain on these wizardly feuds. Peleus has dealt well with me, but I care not if I see him no more. Give me a clean sword and a clean flow to flesh it in. Damnation! What would I not give for a flagon of wine? Awesome. That was it. The headless body reared up from the sands and staggered away in awful flight on stiffening legs, hands blindly outstretched. That's an awesome picture. That was the Scarlet Tower. That was a pretty cool battle at the end too, after a really awesome dungeon crawl. Well, I hope you all enjoyed that. I hope you all have a fantastic Friday and weekend. I will see you back on Monday, where we're going to get back into some more world building. I'm going to pick it back up. Haven't decided if I'm going to clean up that dungeon I started last week or not, if I'm just going to go back to the main map or maybe start another part of it. But we'll find out Monday. I'll see you then. Take care, everyone.